Hi, welcome everyone to today's 20-minute ILTA YouTube podcast entitled Digital Engagement and Connecting People in the Modern Era. I am your moderator, Nicki Kastellorizios-Lee, Leadership Communications Manager at Perkins Coie, and I am thrilled to be joined by our two distinguished panelists, Relandria Adams, Senior Talent Development Specialist at Ogletree Deakins, and Ivy Gray, Chief Strategy and Growth Officer at WordRake. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for having us, Nicki.
Well, I'm really pumped about this conversation because I think it's so timely and so relevant, and we are all spending so much time in virtual spaces. So let's dig right in. In the digital era, I'm not stating anything new when I say that we, as human beings, we have one existence, but sort of in two modes. We have a physical and digital persona. We have a physical presence and a online presence. And from time to time, we can all experience instances of communication breakdown as we are navigating both of those realms really without seams and boundaries day to day. And I think, from time to time, we've all had our turn being sort of stunted by tone difference between something written and spoken. Maybe we're a little panicked by a delayed response over an instant message, an email, or even a virtual meeting. And we've all probably panicked from the vanishing dots of doom that we see sort of surface in our instant message world. So with those sort of things in mind, it raises some questions about what intentional and good digital engagement looks like for staying connected to each other in the modern era. So I want to open with asking you, Ivy, a few things. So how do we ensure that our words, actions, and our digital body language, so to speak, tell the story we want to tell? How do we ensure that we're engaging and nurturing our relationships? And let's start there, and then I want to get into a little more tactical. Like, what do you think are acceptable response rates for email and instant messages in the modern digital workplace?
So I think the key thing to remember is that when we're in person, we rely on head nods and all sorts of other body language to tell that we're connecting and that things are okay. And when we can see each other face to face, we're also using those cues. But when we move to a text-only world or a voice-only world, then we all get a little anxious and we're looking for those cues. And when they aren't there, we're filling in and we're interpreting more than just the words. So when I communicate with other people, I try to lead with kindness and fill in those gaps for them by letting them know that I agree, or it's okay, or I'm reaching out not because something is bad, but just because it would be easier to talk in real time, and nothing is wrong. So that helps to get over that gap between what we know is right and all the anxiety between of what we fear might be wrong.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are some, there's some thought leadership out there about, especially in sort of the instant messaging world, that if something comes in, say, after hours, it's perfectly acceptable to wait until business hours resume to respond. But if it's during business hours, there is sort of this sense of immediacy or as sort of as prompt as possible, because it does create some anxiety when someone has seen your message and has not responded. What do you think are some acceptable response rates for email and for instant message from your perspective?
So emails have more lead time and response time than an instant message or a text. I would think of it more as the value and the expectation of that response. So when you receive a text or an instant message, people are expecting that you're going to respond immediately, but that information isn't going to be as deep and it's less likely to be recorded to the file. Versus if you email, people expect that it may take a little bit longer to get back to you, but that response is going to be recorded to the file, and you are more likely to be judged about the quality of your writing and the content of your response. So you should try to juggle those two things. So instant messages, I think 5 to 20 minutes. Email, anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. And if it's after hours, I know that you aren't supposed to be glued to your phone or your computer, but I do think that you should be checking every couple of hours just to make sure that nothing huge has happened. I know that I would have missed some major opportunities if I never checked my messages after hours.
Yeah, good insight. Relandria, turning to you, what do you think? How do we ensure that our digital body language can tell the story we want to tell, and that we're having these intentional interactions and nurturing our online relationships?
Yeah, I think the question itself is in the word you said about intentional. First of all, with attention, we have to acknowledge that post-pandemic, our attention span has decreased significantly. I think the last number that was produced in 2023, our attention span was at 8 seconds. So imagine that's even gotten shorter since then. So I think that is a part of, communication disparities that happen, whether email or through Teams messages or IMs, things like that, because we skim a lot. We're looking for what we're looking for, and then we're not really checking the entire response. We may miss something, or we may overlook something, and that tone could confuse us or cause an emotion. So I think a lot of it is slowing down, really understanding, okay, what is this message saying to me? If I feel an emotion behind this message, why might that be? And I think we are called to really take a step back to not only understand what we're trying to communicate, but see, okay, why are we trying to communicate this thing? Does it have to be communicated? And if so, does it have to be communicated by me? And if that is the case, then is it now? So I think those are the 3 steps I typically like to follow, and I tell other people to really consider, is it something that you should communicate? If not, then in this moment, or if not in this moment, when? So those are the things I would consider.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good points there. And from your perspective, do you think, sort of going back to the response times, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think those timing windows are, but also, do you think it helps that people do sort of an intermediary response? There's some school of thought out there that says, hey, it's better to say, like, got it, I'll respond to you when I'm back in the office on Tuesday, versus not responding at all until they're back in the office on Tuesday. I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think that communication is important, and I think the more effective you can be in your communication, the better. And so even if you just simply say, to your point, I saw it, I'm out of office, or I'm headed to be out of office, I'll respond later. I think that that helps someone else who may have maybe anxiousness about your message or will be wondering if the message went through. I know technology and Wi-Fi and all of those things that can get in the way, especially now. So just being able to communicate that you received the information, I think that that goes a long way. And as far as hours are concerned, I tend to be a very big advocate of work-life balance or work-life integration. So sometimes I am checking my email, or sometimes I don't want to check it, but my email is on my phone, so it comes through anyway. So depending on the time frame, that's typically how I look at if I respond in that moment or not. Obviously, if it's something that's urgent and it is not a everyday response or everyday issue, then I'll know to check it and respond immediately. Or if I'm going on vacation to prep my team, I'll respond accordingly like that. So I think the hours kind of depend on the obligation, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important nuance, right? Is understanding like you said, to be an effective communicator, it's a two-way street. So you don't want to leave people hanging, so to speak, but you also don't want to always be constantly responding or available, especially if it is going to interfere with striking that integration flow of work and life, right? So I think those are
Yeah.
really good insights.
Can I just add one more thing there?
Yeah.
When you are the boss and you're communicating, it's helpful to add, I'm just getting this off my plate right now. You don't need to respond until tomorrow. And it really eases the lines of communication and those relationships with people if you take that extra step. You can also schedule your messages to send at a different time. But if you're just not one of those schedulers, type in the extra phrase so that people know what your expectations are.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And it all goes back to intentionality, right? You're just being really intentional about your timing, your structure, your content, and how you're delivering it, right? I mean, that's all, I think that's really the crux of this. And so we've sort of through this conversation touched a little bit on what we might call some like ground rules for engagement. Do you think that I'll start here with Relandria. Do you think that there are certain additional nuance and layers that come in with a multi-generational online community and workforce? You know, the types of communication breakdowns we're talking about happen all the time, and I'm sure most of the time rather unwittingly. So, Relandria, starting with you, what are the intergenerational disconnects in digital communication or digital body language? And how do expectations and styles vary? Let's hone in maybe specifically on a law firm setting. How do we get greater inclusivity in our professional engagement?
Yeah, I'd like to say it starts with the root. And so to me, that root is all about culture. A lot of times we can improve our digital presence or be more inclusive through collaboration and culture. So with newer professionals, and when I say newer professionals, I mean Generation Z or even some cuspers, as we call them, of the millennial generation, born at the latter of that generation, view communication very shorthand, meaning I am messaging or a quick phone call or things like that versus more tenured professionals want a more structured email or a phone conversation, even in person. So you can imagine those discrepancies when two generations communicate vastly different. So I think that's one of the things that we have to consider is that we can't just look at things if we've always done it this way. We have to be very open-minded in our approach. And then also too, I think when we're talking about clarifying expectation, what is the norm in this culture or this organization? How should we be communicating? When we're talking about business acumen for particular issues, if we're talking about a case versus a quick recap, what form of communication should we be using to go back to that sense of urgency that we discussed previously? So I think that's first and foremost. And then also too, when we're talking about generations, there is a such thing called the skipping effect, which just simply means that a generation, two generations consecutively tend to not be as quick or adept to building relationships as generations that are not one behind the other. So in order to be inclusive, we could do something like a mentorship where a 10-year generation and a newer generation are mentored are paired together. So now we're getting that historical context and knowledge. Now we're getting a fresh perspective. And that's a very easy way to collaborate and build that culture. So that's just one way to go about it, but that's definitely something I would consider.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I hadn't known that specific nuance of the sort of back-to-back generations and some of the bridging that may need to happen there with their own gaps. Ivy, sort of the same question to you. You know, how do we start to resolve some of these intergenerational disconnects and become more intentional and more inclusive online?
Well, I think the big thing with cultures and generations is that they're ingrained in each of us, and most of us can't actually define them. We don't notice them until there's some sort of conflict or something goes wrong. So that leads right to the intentionality thing that you were thinking of. So I try to come up with why people might have certain expectations and then fill in my communication from that perspective. So for example, reliability and respect are two major things in the workplace. And for younger generations, they expect to be assumed that they are reliable and that you will be reliable to the older generation. But respect should be earned for themselves, and your superiors should also have to earn your respect. For the older generations, it's flipped, where you are unreliable until proven otherwise. And you also need to give respect unless you lose it. So it can create these conflicts in how you manage the communications. So one of the ways that plays out is with giving assignments. Sorry, this is so long-winded, but an older generation might pick up the phone to call a younger generation or an associate to give an assignment. And when that happens, the person who's responsible for taking the notes and figuring out what that assignment really means is the associate who's receiving the information on the other end of the call. And associates typically don't like to be on a phone call. But if the associate expects the partner, who is typically from an older generation, to be the one giving the assignment and they want it via email, then that means the responsibility for thinking through the entire assignment and linking all of the different pieces falls on the older generation. And it seems disrespectful to ask them to do all of that groundwork when you're the one who's supposed to be assisting the partner. So that's how I would tie in the communication and the intergenerational aspects.
That was actually a really great segue, because I wanted to sort of start applying some of the things we're talking about conceptually to the law firm environment and law firm culture. And so you've started to do that. So Relandria, I want to sort of point it over to you about the types of disconnects and disparities that pervade. And I know you touched on it briefly, but I'm wondering, do you think that considerations around work-life integration, hybrid environment, especially that whole component of remote and asynchronous collaboration between partners and associates, do you think that there are additional considerations for digital engagement and connectivity there that you'd like to highlight?
So I would say that, it depends on the professional. For some, remote work is really great, and for others, it can be a challenge. And so the two things that come to mind is advocacy and support. And so one of the things with digital disparities is that you have to treat the digital space just as you would the physical space, meaning that if you see someone that's struggling, or if you see someone that's not speaking up, calling them in versus calling them out can be very important, and using your platform or your position to support. So I think that's one way to go about it. And then with integration, as much as we love to, work remotely and have that obligation to work freely, it can be a challenge for some individuals. So owning that and also being mindful of that can be helpful, but also knowing that digital tools can blur boundaries. So going back to that 9 p.m. email, I may feel obligated to answer it, or I may consider it to be a sense of urgency. So having that communication, being able to be mindful of that, and then also too, working together, I think that helps to kind of mitigate the gap, I would say, digitally. So those are the things that come to mind there as far as disparities are concerned.
Yeah, that's great insight. I think, Ivy, at one point, you had mentioned in a previous conversation something about a sense of obligation being different in law firm culture, and I think you started to allude to it as well. But do you think that obligation to a task is different when it's delivered by phone versus email? You sort of started to touch on that in your last answer, but I guess I'm just curious if you could highlight that a little more.
So I think that the deliverable is different based on how you get it. So if it's a text, it is less valuable but more urgent. If it's an email, it is less urgent, more valuable. So you have to keep those things in mind. And I really think that we've covered most of it, and I know we're running out of time. So I think that's really all I've got to add. Relandria did just such a great job. So I'll let it stand.
I'll just add one more thing to the digital disparities. I
Sure.
think that if we kind of start from the ground and build those relationships, that also helps with avoiding people always having to be on, taking a second to use every opportunity to get to know someone beyond their title, beyond their work responsibilities. That also helps to bridge that gap. So that's the one thing I didn't cover, but I find that to be most important, building those relationships.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. I mean, we talk about just going back to the beginning of the conversation about having like one existence, but two personas or maybe two modes, but really we're 360, right? We have personal, professional lives, obligations, and all kinds of things going on. And sometimes, the way we interpret things as they're being delivered to us is a reflection of maybe just all the things we're being consumed by at any given day, right? Or any given moment. It gets so granular with digital engagement because it only takes seconds or even nanoseconds to communicate with someone, or thumbs up something, or deletes something. And so there's all these like ripple effects and impacts that can happen from very, very seemingly small interactions and seemingly very short interactions, but they do have ripple effect. And I think that it all goes back to intentionality. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been very insightful, and each of you has brought a lot of insight and experience to your to the conversation. So I guess I'd like to conclude by asking one more question. It's a little bit layered, but I'd like to see if you let's see. Let's start with Relandria. What do you think is a tried and true practice for building greater awareness and intentionality in digital presence or digital engagement?
I guess building off of my previous point about engagement, I am a very big advocate of practicing gratitude. I think being able to be gracious and grateful for someone sharing their perspective. I like to say that feedback is a gift. So even someone sharing their insight with you, or commenting on your LinkedIn post and sharing their thoughts, or choosing to be vulnerable and giving you a piece of what they believe to be true based on what you say. I think that we should take those moments for granted. So for me, I definitely say adding that gratitude, especially as a leader, to your team or to individuals, I think that's important. And also diversifying your approach. So figuring out how to get the message across, whether that's through a micro learning opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, younger generations appreciate something that's quick, like a reel, versus tenured professionals want more something tangible. So diversifying your approach and knowing your audience are the two things that I implement, and I think those are great practices for digital aspects.
Thank you.
All right.
Ivy?
Mine
Ivy?
would be to give first. So, with everything that you do, think about how you can support others before you ask anything from them or ask anything of them. So, be the cheerleader, be the person who says, great job, be the person who comments and shares and boosts others. And it creates a good community where people will, maybe they'll support you, maybe they'll support somebody else, but everybody wants to contribute to a team and a community where others are giving.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Ivy and Relandria, for your time and the expertise shared today. We hope that the audience will soon get to view and then enjoy this and proceed to like and comment on the recording, and also subscribe to ILTA YouTube and ILTA Voices. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.